Stay tuned. Ahead I'll talk with Alex Segura about his latest novel, Alter Ego. It's a sequel to his best-selling and award-winning Secret Identity novel. Both novels are mysteries set in the world of comic book creators. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Alex Segura's other novels include the Pete Fernandez series, a Star Wars novel, Poe Dameron, Freefall, and a Spider-Verse adventure called Aranya Spider-Man 2099, Dark Tomorrow. Alex, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
Well, this book is a sequel of sorts to the Secret Identity novel, so tell us about Alter Ego and how the two books are connected.
Sure. Alter Ego, we're calling it a standalone sequel, which is to say, if you read both books, you'll get a bigger picture. And if you read the graphic novel as well, you'll get a better sense of the whole story. But Alter Ego can very much stand on its own. It's a murder mystery set in the modern day comic book industry. And the protagonist is Annie Bustamante, a former comic book artist who is now a filmmaker. And we catch her at a little bit of a low point. She's between projects. Her last movie was shelved for tax reasons. And so she's kind of going back to her inspiration, which is this character called the Legendary Lynx, an obscure superhero that was printed briefly in the 70s and then disappeared into the ether. But it is the character that brought Annie into comic books and made a career for her. So as she waits for her next film deal, she's drawing and writing this fan comic when suddenly she gets an email from someone from a company called Triumph Entertainment. And they claim to own this character and own the Triumph catalog. And they want Annie to come back to comics and write and launch and draw this new comic book series. So it seems like a dream situation for her, and she's excited. But as she gets deeper and deeper into it, she realizes that there's some dark stuff bubbling under the surface. And she starts getting these anonymous messages from someone called Apparition. And Apparition is a character from the Lynx comics, and Apparition is telling Annie, to be careful, be wary of these people who may not actually be the creators of the character that Annie loves.
There's so much that, even though it's a standalone, when I was reading Alter Ego, I thought, man, I've got to read that first novel now, because it just kept piquing questions for me and how they're tied together, because at the beginning of Alter Ego, it begins with the woman who's writing Secret Identity. And so, already there's these tie-ins. And in a bit, we'll have to talk about the Lynx comic as well, because once again, you're mixing reality with fantasy, and it's all very meta, I guess, is one way of putting it.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely what I was going for. And what's funny is that after Secret Identity and Alter Ego both have comic book sequences in the novel. So you're reading the novel and you get pulled into the comic. So in Alter Ego, you get to read the comic that Annie is working on. In Secret Identity, you read the original Lynx comics. And what happened is we took those original pages and expanded them and remastered and recolored. And we treated it very much like it was the actual comic book from this world published again for the first time. I've actually had people after reading Secret Identity call me and email me and say, I've gone to comic shops all over my neighborhood and I cannot find an issue of the Lynx. So that was really gratifying. I think people want to believe that this character exists, and now it does.
So this book draws a lot upon your own personal experience with the comic book industry. And one of the things Annie talks about is representation, and that as a Cuban, she is not represented in the comics, and she was really thrilled to find this woman who was of Cuban ancestry who was actually writing comics.
Yeah, I think it's really important. It was important for me as a reader to identify with characters as a young reader or creators. And I think it's important that the work we put out into the world reflects the world. I think it's great to have diverse protagonists, diverse characters, diverse cultures and situations. And I think that's a key part of the story, that if Annie had not had that moment of identification, if she hadn't seen a piece of herself in a comic book, she might not have gone down that path to become a comic book creator. I've had people reach out to me and say, it's so important that you're writing these characters that are like me, because I never see myself, as the protagonist or as the star. And that's something that I try to think about in everything I do.
Well, not only is Annie identifying with these comics is very formative in her life, when she actually gets into the industry, she finds out she has a lot of obstacles. among them just being a woman. And did you sort of draw upon your experience and observations within the comic industry to bring that point to life?
Yeah, I mean, my experiences are different as a man in comics, so I definitely there was not as much I could pull from my own personal experience, just from what I'd seen, and also from conversations. I spoke to a lot of friends who worked in comics and just kind of got gut checks on how the story was going and whether it felt genuine. I think it's come a long way over the last 20 odd years, but I don't think Annie's experience is unique to her.
Well, this book has been called a love letter to comics. And one of the things that Annie experienced, and perhaps you do too, is that it's a passion for you, but it's not necessarily the best financial choice or job security choice.
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge of being a freelancer. You enjoy the work you're doing, but you're always half of your brain is always thinking about, well, what am I going to do next when this thing is over? It doesn't have the security of an office job or a day job with a pension and insurance and and all those things that we all hope for. But it is a love. It's for the love of the game. It's just you grow up reading these things and loving them and these characters and these worlds, and you want to just add to the mythos a little bit. And it's hard to not do that if given the opportunity.
And Annie is given this opportunity. Even though she's gone on to bigger and better things in the movies, etc., in her heart, she still has this pull back to comics, which on one hand is great for her, but on the other hand, it seems, and not give away spoilers here, but anyone that gets too close to this Legendary Lynx story, it doesn't work out well for them.
Yeah, as Annie starts to get more involved with this project, she starts to realize that a lot of people, like you said, who have become involved with this character have died, for lack of a better term, or disappeared, or not been properly credited. And then she takes it upon herself. Annie is fearless, she's driven, she's stubborn, and she's willing to call people on things that she sees them. So she's not one to just roll over and accept her fate. She really takes it as a challenge to tell the story she wants to tell, but also spotlight these creators that didn't get the credit they deserved at the time.
And there's also a mother-daughter relationship in this story. Tell us about that.
Yeah, early on, as kind of Annie's character was coming together, I realized I wanted her to be a parent. I think it's something that we don't see as often as we should in thrillers. It's just easier to have a character that doesn't have the responsibility of caring for their kids or a spouse or, personal responsibilities, because then they can very easily just hop in a car and go do the work. But I think it was really interesting to have this character, her daughter, Margot, play off her and give her a peek into the Annie that she was before, like this wide-eyed kid who loved comics and loved the energy that they brought, and not as jaded as the Annie we meet at the beginning of the story. So their relationship is really kind of the backbone of the present day narrative.
I'm talking with Alex Segura about his novel Alter Ego, and our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Besides being an engaging read, is there a takeaway for readers here?
At its heart, Alter Ego is a thriller. It's a fun page turner, I hope, and people will find that it's engaging and entertaining, but it's also a tour through an industry that not everyone really knows that well. I think people know a lot about the movies and the product, but hopefully it gives them a nice peek under the hood and still keeps them entertained. That's the goal at the end of the day.
Well, speaking of that peek under the hood, let's talk a little bit about your background in comics, because it's quite extensive. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I've been in comics for about 20 years. I was a reader as a child. My first comic was an Archie comic at the checkout line, and then I became, one of the Wednesday warriors. Every week I'd go to the comic shop and pick up some new issues. And then I worked in the industry doing publicity and marketing for different places like DC and Archie and Oni Press, but I was also writing them, and I have been writing them for a long time. So I've gotten to see comics from various angles and different perspectives, and that really informed this novel, which is these two books, Secret Identity and Alter Ego, are very much a culmination of all the things I love. Mysteries, Miami, comic books, all blended together into this hopefully fun read.
There's a question I like to ask authors of fiction, and it's this. If you could spend a day in real life with one of the characters from Alter Ego, who would it be and why?
Oh, I would love to hang out with Annie. I think she's fascinating. And I don't say that as an egotistical comment because she's my character, but I think she's just reminds me of so many people I would be friends with. Like she's very much someone I would want to be friends with and hang out with or have a laugh with or just talk comics with. And I think that's really a testament to the work. You create characters you want to be around or you would react to in a certain way. And Annie's definitely a character that I could see myself being friends with.
Alex, earlier you mentioned that reader who told you they'd tried to find the Legendary Lynx comic book in their store and couldn't. And I was doing research for this interview, and I would look up the Legendary Lynx, and there would be references to the original authors and what happened to them. You know, one was murdered, the other took his own life, and some other issues that were surrounding this book. And if you just clicked off and went on, you would think that that's a real comic book from the mid-1970s. But if you keep reading, it would finally say toward the end, but in reality, you created the comics for these books. And you've taken this one step further now. You've actually created a graphic novel so that these comic books are now existing in the real world, but with that same idea that these are really from the mid-1970s and they're back after 50 years.
Well, I love those kind of stories. I love meta storytelling. I love things that weave through history. And there was a point with Secret Identity where my editor said, well, you can either keep this grounded in reality and have to deal with history, or you can just kind of create it all and basically have winks and nods to characters like Superman or what have you. But I always wanted the former. I wanted this story to feel like it could have existed. And so to give you that moment of doubt, like, did this happen? Like, was there a Lynx character? And so when we did the comic book, the graphic novel, I wanted to really lean into the gag, I guess, for lack of a better term, to treat it like it was this comic that had been lost to the sands of time and was being republished for the first time. And I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, I didn't know this even came out in the 70s. And obviously I tell them, I don't want to punk people, but people want to believe that this existed. And we've really manifested, Sandy Jarrell, the artist, and I have manifested this character into comic book history, which is kind of fascinating.
Well, you've got this whole backstory about finding original prints and having to scan them and recolor them. And so you're kind of feeding that whole narrative that this really is a publication. And you've also kind of aged it to make it look like, you know, existed back then, but yet it's dealing with contemporary themes.
Yeah, it definitely, one of the interesting parts of that story was, aside from just taking the pages from Secret Identity and then building a story around those interstitial sequences, we had to create content that fit the time, you know, and back then there was a comics code that really limited what you could say and what you could produce in terms of violence, sexual content, anything like that. So, you know, you have to kind of code some of the things you say because of the limitations of the time. And that was an interesting exercise. And what I thought was going to be a very street level kind of Daredevil superhero comic ended up becoming almost a supernatural, trippy 1970s cosmic story, which was a pleasant surprise.
Well, having been in the industry as long as you have, how do you rate the state of the industry today?
I think it's as vibrant as ever in terms of awareness. Like you look at your marquee as you walk by the theater and half the movies are comic book movies. You turn on your streaming service and you'll see superhero movies, Star Wars movies. I think the pop culture awareness for these characters is at an all-time high. And I think the accessibility of the content, like the core comics, is greater than it was before. You know, I used to get my comics at the newsstand or at the comic shop, and I can still do that. But now I can also go into bookstores. You can find them online, digitally, anywhere. And I just think the awareness is really what matters. And creating awareness and driving people to buy the comics is working.
Do you think society's attitudes about comics have changed also over the decades?
Yeah, I don't think they treat it as like a juvenile kind of kiddie thing anymore. I think there are great comics for kids, but it's a medium. You know, you can tell any kind of story in comics, whether it's a superhero story, a crime story, sci-fi story, a kid's book, a middle grade story. So I think people are starting to realize that the possibilities are endless in comics, and that's what's drawing a lot more people to the medium.
Well, for those who love comics and enjoy a good mystery, you have 2 books out now. You have Secret Identity and Alter Ego, and now the comic book. What's next for you?
I am working on a novel starring Daredevil, the Marvel superhero, that'll be coming out next year sometime. And I'm a chunk into my next crime novel, which will hopefully come out next year or the following. And writing a lot of comics. I'm writing stuff for Marvel and DC, Star Wars, Battle of Jakku, The Question for DC, and some stuff I can't announce yet.
The novel is Alter Ego by Alex Segura. Alex, thank you for talking with me today.
Well, Dan, it's a pleasure. Always great to chat with you. Good to see you.
If you'd like to purchase Alter Ego, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.